Today, I'm so pleased to have with me Dr. Dean Radin. This is a very special interview because Dean is the chief scientist at the Institute of Noetic Sciences. He's an associate distinguished professor at the California Institute of Integral Studies and co-founder and vice chairman of the neuroengineering company CognaGenics. Before joining ION's research staff in 2001, Dean worked at AT&T Bell Labs, Princeton University, University of Edinburgh, and SRI International, and he's given over 780 talks internationally and worldwide. And I had the pleasure of being in the audience for a couple of Dean's talks, and I must say they're great talks, but what impressed me the most were his amazing slides and presentation, just really brilliant. He's the inventor of 12 patents and author or co-author of 340 books, scientific articles, and book chapters. And again, I'm particularly happy to have him join me today because Dean is more than a scientist in my perspective. He is a pioneer and an explorer at the boundaries of science. And what distinguishes him in the work that he does is the rigorous nature of his scientific procedures and approach, which force the scientific establishment to take note of his findings. Welcome, leaders. In a world constantly evolving, true leadership requires resilience, presence, vision, and a willingness to embrace challenge and change. I'm Dr. Stephen Sideroff, and this is Quantum Leadership Podcast, where we go beyond conventional leadership to explore the principles that connect mind, body, and organizational success. Dean, what a pleasure to have you here.
Happy to be here.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm so curious to begin with about your neuroengineering company, CognaGenics, that you are a co-founder of. Can you just, before we get started, say what that's all about?
We are developing an intranasal delivery of RNA interference edits. And the purpose is that when you take psychiatric drugs, typically in the form of a pill, or if you're unlucky as some sort of injection, and even more unlucky, an injection directly into the brain or in the cerebral spinal fluid, oftentimes the side effects are quite bad. In fact, you will find some of the drugs, psychiatric drugs, where it might be a black box warning saying this might help you, but it could also kill you. And that's, a way of showing that the side effects are pretty bad in some cases. And one of the reasons that happens is because when you're modulating how the brain is working, at the same time you're modulating other things within the body. So if you take an SSRI drug, for example, you're going to have pretty bad GI problems because it's the same serotonin receptors. All 14 or 15 of those receptors are going to be affected. So what we came up with is an RNA interference method that precisely targets certain serotonin receptors, in particular 5-HT2A, which is strongly associated with things like anxiety, like chronic anxiety, with depression, with memory problems, with a whole long list of psychiatric problems. They're all traced back to that as like the king receptor. So our interference method only knocks down those receptors, a very small percentage of them, but through intranasal delivery it goes into the frontal cortex and slowly diffuses back into the back of the brain, especially the limbic system. So we have done preclinical work with animals showing that it very significantly reduces anxiety, and at the same time, it increases memory, almost 100% increase in memory. So
amazing.
So this would be a treatment. It is a drug, but we don't think of it in those terms. It's more like a therapeutic treatment that is very precise, easy to take because it's intranasal. It would last a long time. There are several different versions of this. One of it would be a DNA change, which will last forever. And then something called short hairpin RNA, which would last for probably months. And the latest version is siRNA, which would last for weeks. So if you had chronic anxiety or OCD or dementia or whatever you're dealing with, rather than having to take a pill every day and deal with the side effects, you would do the intranasal delivery. At this point, we're thinking maybe every 3 weeks, maybe every 2 months, and it would produce pretty significant relief. At this point, probably without either any side effects at all or minor side effects, because it's not affecting the rest of the body.
That's amazing, because you're being so specific with the targeting that you seem to avoid a lot of the side effects in the typical approaches. That's great.
And apropos to the topics that we're talking about, especially noticing the picture behind you, the picture of the subtle body, the idea for this came from two different directions. One was that my co-founder partner had a download during an LSD trip 50 years ago, where he kind of got the idea about how to do this, but the technology wasn't available. So he told me about that, and I realized, oh, you know what? We actually are on the cusp of being able to do this now, to do direct, very precision editing within the brain intranasally. Okay, so that's part of it. The other part is that because most of my professional career has been focused on experiences that we call psychic, non-local aspects of consciousness, we know that there are, first of all, an enormous amount of folklore and also some experimental work showing that these kinds of talents run in families, meaning there's probably a genetic component to it. So we did a small-scale study to see if there were differences between people who had psychic experiences in families like that versus people who didn't. And we did find a genetic difference. So in thinking about that, we thought, well, it might be interesting in the future if you could take an intranasal delivery, which would make you psychic for a month. And, you know, there are many professions where that would actually be quite useful. And so in order to get the money required in order to develop such a thing, it would cost tens of millions of dollars. We decided to take a more pragmatic route first and target things like dementia, which, of course, there's a huge need for that.
Right.
And that's what we're doing.
That's brilliant. Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you. So today, Dean and the audience, the talk is going to be in two parts. First, we're going to talk about quantum effects, quantum leadership. But in the second part, I'd like Dean to talk a little bit about his new and latest book, The Science of Magic. And we will get into that later. But I'd like to begin for you to describe the field that you would say you work in and how you got interested in this field.
Well, I work at the Institute of Noetic Sciences. The word noetic is roughly speaking a form of deep intuition. And so there's two major categories of intuition, which of course in business is critical. One type I can describe as forgotten expertise. When somebody does a job forever, they learn all kinds of things, and it's not always at the top of your mind. So sometimes you need to make fast judgments about something or get a feeling, but that's based on a lot of knowledge. It's just not at the tip of your head. So that's conventional intuition. The other type of intuition is when you get a download of something, you may not be expecting it, you have no idea where the information came from. And more importantly, it turns out that you have a feeling of certainty that is correct, that insight, and more often than not, in fact, it is correct. So those are the two types. So we're interested in then the second type, where it's like, how do we get that information? Where does it come from?
That was going to be my next question. Where does this download come from?
Right. So we don't exactly know where the download comes from, but what we can do from a scientific perspective is test whether or not the information is correct. So that's where, for over a century now, people have been doing studies to see, well, is it possible to gain information about some target system or image or whatever at a distance or shielded so that you can't access that information through inference or through your normal senses. So the vernacular that would be ESP, it's clairvoyance, it's telepathy, it's all of those words that are used as labels to describe what is ultimately an experience. And many, many people have had these experiences. They may or may not say that they believe in psychic abilities because it's not socially acceptable to say that. But when you ask people about what kinds of experiences that they've had, the vast majority of people will say, oh yeah, there was that one time that I somehow knew what was going to happen. And they either don't talk about it or they sometimes even forget that it happens until they're asked. So in the laboratory, we take those experiences and figure out a way of testing under controlled conditions. Is that what it appears to be? Like, did you really get information from a distance? And then we'll get some kind of impression, and we can test that against a ground truth to see whether it's there. And to make a very long story short, yeah, these experiences exist because we can test them in the laboratory repeatedly, independently, and we see the same effects again and again. So we know the phenomenon exists. At this point, they're still struggling with theories to describe why they exist. And there are some up-and-coming theories which help us understand why that happens.
Yeah. And I think what's important in what you just said is that the research shows that there is something real there, whether we know the mechanism or not.
Yeah, and that's how all of science has proceeded. You see observations, they remain anomalies, sometimes for a very long time, until the rest of theoretical science catches up, and then you can say, oh, that's why this is happening, because we now have a framework to understand it. Well, I think we're actually getting quite close to that now. After psychic phenomena have been around forever, we're slowly approaching a time within a scientific framework that says, okay, well, this actually is an adequate explanation for why these things occur.
Let's take this into the realm of quantum physics and the quantum effect. And I'm wondering if you would say that the research in quantum physics and the quantum effect perhaps may explain the mechanism for the findings that you're getting.
So the connection is this. So there's two things within quantum mechanics that are considered weird, at least described that way in the popular press. So one aspect is its non-locality. It is a non-local nature, that things are connected through space and time. So that's relatively easy to demonstrate in the laboratory at this point, for pure physics laboratory, that things are connected through space and time. The second thing is the quantum observer effect, which is very different than classical physics, because now the observer effect says that when you observe a quantum object, that its properties will change as a result of gaining information about that. And we don't know why that is. That's why Einstein complained about this. And he said, well, is it like, if you don't look at the moon, is it still there? Well, from an everyday experience perspective, yeah, if you're not looking at something, you assume it's there. But from a philosophical perspective, you actually can't know if it's there or not. You need to measure it. But in quantum mechanics, it's worse than that, because we know that if you measure a photon by detecting it in some way, for example, its properties do change measurably. So this is an unresolved problem in quantum mechanics. And so we have two things here. One is non-locality, and the other one is that observation changes the physical world in some way. So what are psychic phenomena? There's two elements that are weird. One is that somehow things seem to be connected through space and time. We have perceptions that transcend time. The other one, though, is an aspect of agency. This is like consciousness has two elements of it. One is perception, the other one is doing things. So it looks like the agency part of psychic phenomena are called psychokinetic effects. It's impressing your intention out into the world, and then something changes as a result. So we have a very close parallel between the strangeness of quantum mechanics and the strangeness of experiences that are called psychic. They involve perception through space and time and action through space and time. And so some would say that's a coincidence, that you're using one mystery to explain another mystery. And I would say, I don't think so, because those two mysteries are exactly the same mysteries that you would require from a physical perspective to explain what is happening internally as an experience.
So in science, we think about, and I'm not up on the latest, but we think about what happens in the real or macro world, the world that you and I live in. And then there's the science that happens on the quantum level, the extremely small atomic level, where we have these notions of the observer effect and entanglement. And I'm wondering if you think that these psi experiences that you study may be the evidence manifestation of the quantum world impacting the macro real life world that you and I live in.
Sure. Yeah, and the quantum phenomena don't only happen at the micro level. I mean, there's more and more studies showing that it scales up and affects things at large, and importantly, including in biological systems. So up until 15 or 20 years ago, the idea that there were quantum phenomena happening within living systems, including us, was considered laughable, like it couldn't work. Well, now we know it does work. And there's growing evidence that it also occurs in the brain.
Can you give us one example of that?
Well, so one of the better known examples is the so-called ORC-R theory of Stu Hameroff and Roger Penrose, who are proposing that microtubules in every neuron in the brain are basically operating at the quantum scale. They sustain quantum coherence. And so it doesn't take a giant leap of inference at this point to imagine that it's not like we suddenly become quantum. We must have been this way all along, right? So physics says that ultimately everything in the body is quantum. The question is it operating in a quantum coherent fashion? Well, so ORC-R, orchestrated reduction, that's what it means. That says that we have quantum processes continually operating within the brain and the body. We know it works in birds. We know it works in plants. It's there. It's like an aspect of quantum biology that we know exists. So now imagine that your brain is not simply a classical object. It's not working like a computer anymore, at least a classical computer, but it has always worked partially as a quantum computer. Well, so it's going to have two elements to it that a classical computer don't have. There will be nonlocal aspects and there will be agency. Well, now it suddenly looks like that's getting pretty darn close to a brain developing that we have ordinary perception coming one way, but now we have quantum ways that are suggesting that you're mostly in there, but you're not completely in there because there's non-local components that spread out to the ends of the universe, and not only in space, in time as well. So we have developed in this way, maybe for millions of years, and it would be extremely unlikely that an organism had not learned to take advantage of these abilities because they are extremely useful. As we see in photosynthesis would not work unless there were quantum elements to it. I think that we will eventually find that the brain will not work in the way that we think of it as working, also without certain degrees of quantum coherence.
You know, as a psychologist and scientist myself, when I do my research, I'm very careful and, through my whole career, very careful to not influence the study that I'm working on, but now, and with this notion of the observer effect, a whole different perspective occurs where I recognize that I have, as the observer, an influence on what I'm observing. And so in my work, I think about that in terms of intention, where I place my energy, but also the kind of energy that I project out into the world, whether I'm coming from a place, say, of love or coming from a place of anger, all has an influence. And, scientifically, I know that my heart rate patterns, which hold patterns of anger or gratitude, can be picked up in the EEG of someone that's close to me. So it's turning everything upside down. And I'd love your opinion on how this notion of observer effect can be used in a positive way.
Well, I'll preface that first by saying that the nature of these phenomena are a very strong challenge to our epistemology, because a normal experimental epistemology assumes that you can isolate things. It's the whole point of having a control test. Well, if you can't have a control condition because everything is actually connected at some level, then we're almost like fooling ourselves that we can create experiments under extremely rigorous control where things are isolated so you can compare A versus B. As long as there's an experimenter involved who knows about these kinds of phenomena, that's a problem. And even if you had participants in an experiment who didn't know that they were double blind against something else, some element of them knows that. And so it introduces enormous complexity in trying to figure out what is causing what and what's correlated with what. It's a combination of very frustrating from a conventional scientific point of view, but from my perspective, it's an amazing challenge to figure out how do you do this? How do you do experiments like this where you're dealing with an epistemology that was based on 17th century idea of the way the world works, but we're in the 21st century. Where it's not so disconnected anymore. So what do you do then? Well, you simply have to have better control over your attention and your intention. And so how do you do that? The classic way is through meditation, becoming mindful about not only how you're reacting or interacting with somebody else, but what intentions you're holding. And of course, life gets in the way. And so maybe there's something on your mind and it's sort of rattling around in there and you're trying to interact with somebody. How do you get rid of all of that? You can't really, but maybe by acknowledging it and having a practice where you simply say, okay, for the next hour, this is it. That's all that there is. And all this other stuff that's always buzzing around everybody's lives, you simply have to say, I'm going to set it aside for a while as best as I can. And of course, all of this is conscious. What's going on below that, the unconscious, we have very little control over by definition. It's unconscious.
Right. Well, you talk about this new reality or a reality we're more and more aware of as a challenge, which I totally agree. But for me, the challenge is how to use this in a positive way, in a constructive way, in a useful way. And that takes me to each of us as the observer and having this influence. And it makes it, to me, more and more important that we each understand, know our own biases, our own misinterpretations of the world that can set the direction inaccurately, inappropriately, and have that impact on the rest of the world from that perspective, which may be a little bit off because of our wounding, because of our emotional unfinished business and things like that. Would you agree with that?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I would also add, though, it's kind of easier said than done.
Right.
Again, because of unconscious motivations and holding and biases. I once looked up, I was wondering how many different kinds of biases that we have and filters, like 100. I mean, it's astonishing that it means that the world as we perceive it most of the time is a very, very thin cartoon about what's actually happening. And it takes a lot of work, which is why I guess psychotherapy can take your entire life, to kind of begin to take the onion and take the peels off of it to figure out, well, what is the core? And of course, that's one of the primary goals of a meditative life, is to get closer and closer to the ultimate core, and to which is interesting. Then you go in, especially like in Buddhism, you get to the core and there's nothing there. There's nothing left except awareness.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So
right.
I'm way far away from that center core, but occasionally get a glimpse of what that might be like.
Right. Exactly. And the goal or the intention is to always be working toward getting there or being there as much of the time as possible.
Yep.
So now let's kind of veer a little bit and take this conversation into the realm of leadership, and with the intention to apply what we're talking about right now to leadership. And so a question for you is, I know, as we're talking, we've explored how consciousness might influence quantum systems. That's really what we're we're talking about, would you say leadership itself is a quantum phenomena? Something shaped by intention, observation, and entanglement? Because if we take that next step, then we realize that a leadership position magnifies all of what we're talking about.
Yeah, I know very, very little about what it takes to be a leader. I have been very clear in my career to not ever be in management, because that involves leadership, because I've recognized that's not where my forte is. I'm basically like a bench scientist. That's where I'm happy, in the laboratory and doing empirical things.
But that's where you and I come together, because I'm getting from you certain perspectives that we can apply here to leadership.
Yeah. So if somebody in a leadership position has to be a model that it attracts other people, otherwise they're not going to be followed. So there is something about, and this is related, is probably not direct related, but you'll see the connection. So occasionally I've been around people who have been very, very long-term meditators, and also leaders of organizations as meditators. They don't feel normal in a good sense. So I was at a conference once, and a leader of one of these organizations came into the room and was going to go up to the stage. I immediately felt that. I felt that something has changed in the room. And then I heard her walking up and I turned around and looked at her and said, oh, okay, that's what it was. So there's a certain presence that some people have. I've seen this with the Dalai Lama as well, been in his presence. They radiate something which kind of pulls your attention. And this is a part of a long history within the yogic traditions, that there's one of the powers or siddhis that the advanced yogis can get, which is sometimes translated as radiating goodness. You can feel it, like everyone is pulled towards it. Well, so imagine that if you have a leader who has such a degree of charisma, which is attractive, their ability to lead is going to be way better than it would be if they just stood up there and there was like nothing coming out of them. So exactly what it is that they're doing is almost certainly related to the aspect of their consciousness. That can become a kind of, not a chaotic attractor, but an attractor of some type that most people can feel, and animals, by the way, too.
Right. And the same would apply if that person is walking up onto stage carrying a lot of their upsets, worries, etc. That too, that kind of energy will be projected as well.
Right. You can project the distraction. You can probably project something that says, I don't want to pay attention to this person. Like, I need to leave now. So it's true. It can go in either direction.
Yeah. Can we talk for a moment about your work with the Global Consciousness Project?
Yeah.
And which here again suggests collective intention and its impact. And then I want to take that in a particular direction, but I'd love you to just say a little bit about that.
So we call it the GCP. So the GCP project started in 1998, and it's still running. We've recently started phase 2. We call it GCP 2. The idea of this came out of laboratory studies where we would use truly random number generators based on quantum events, which are just like bit flippers. They would be running while in the laboratory, typically you would ask somebody to intentionally try to influence the statistical properties of the output. And we can see that. So there's lots of labs that have replicated these effects, have been published many, many times. And so it's tiny little probabilistic effects that we see in the lab, but with enough data, you can have high confidence that it's a real thing. So one time my colleague, Roger Nelson, who was at Princeton, around the time that I was there, he discovered that you actually don't need intention. What you need is attention. Of course, they're closely coupled. And attention has to come first, and then you can put intention on top of it. So he said, well, what if I went to a place where there's very high attention and, like modulating attention, like a theatrical presentation or a chorus or something like that, where people get together and then you can infer that there's a large amount of attention focusing in. So he did that. And he found that the random generators were not quite so random during periods where a lot of people were having what could be called coherent attention, all focused on the same thing. So then I started doing those experiments, and I found the same thing. And so in 1998, we decided to make it a system that would be running all the time, rather than like a one-shot experiment. And so it evolved into a worldwide network of many random number generators going all the time. So we have this monstrous database. And the idea was, with all of these generators running all the time, each one sending samples, we get summaries that are continuous. What would happen if during a time when there wasn't something that attracted the world's attention as compared to times when it would attract the world's attention? In order to figure out what the latter meant, we would wait until something either happened spontaneously, like the death of a celebrity or a terrorist act, which we know would attract a lot of attention, or we would select celebrations and things that were planned in advance. In both cases, whenever we thought, okay, this event seems like it would be good, we would specify what is the length of that event from the point of view of how much attention is being paid to that. So we define that. Then we would go look at the data. We'd use a standardized way of analyzing the results. And so we did that for 500 events over there from 1998 to 2015. And the overall results was 7 standard errors from chance, or in physics speak, 7 sigma result. So the odds against chances.
So extremely unlikely, or
odds against chance
to happen by chance,
yeah,
right?
3 trillion to 1 against chance.
Okay.
Yeah, you would find these deviations.
Number.
Yeah, you'd find that's the odds against chance of finding the deviations that we saw during those periods where we didn't look at the data first. We selected the event and then we looked at the data. And then you can do lots of other analyses. Like you can say, let's take the events that we looked at, the 500 events, slide them backwards and forwards in time. So they're no longer those events. They happen before and after. And what you get is something that basically looks sort of flat, and then boom, there's a big effect when it's in time sync, and then it goes away. So that's this sort of a statistical analysis. Is a way of showing that something happened at a particular time, which is what the hypothesis was. We've kept that data running, and now GCP2 uses a much fancier form of random generator, where it's not generating bits anymore, it's generating noise itself, quantum noise. And the reason we do that is because, first of all, we have now over 1,000 of these generators running around the world. The second is that we can reverse engineer based on what the noise is doing, or you couldn't do that if you just had bits. The bits showed us that something was happening, but it's very difficult to figure out why. Now we can go back and try to figure out, well, what is happening all the way down at the level of how the electrons were behaving, for example.
So you have all these 1,000 random generators around the world. You have a major event that draws the world's attention, and suddenly on all of these random generators, you see a significant change.
You see it on composite. If you were to look at one of those generators, you might or might not see an effect because it might be there, but it would be really, really tiny. It's the composite looking at how the whole system is behaving. That's where you begin to see these effects.
Now, can you distinguish positive events from negative events by looking at those results?
There is some evidence that the valence of the effect, whether it's positive or negative, has an effect. So in general, things like celebrations, large-scale meditations, that sort of thing, have a larger effect than shocking and negative outcomes. But both of them do show effects.
I know you've done some studies involving groups meditating and the results that happen as a result of that. I'm thinking in terms of leadership. And I have this notion of, with an array of radio telescopes, you magnify the power of the individual radio telescopes by putting it into an array where essentially the power of the array is equivalent to the diameter of the 2 radio telescopes that are the furthest apart. So they act as this giant radio telescope. And I'm wondering, And I'm saying this because I have chairing a panel on quantum leadership. And I want to do a little experiment here because I'm wondering, I know with the radio telescopes, the key to having all of those work together is having them perfectly in sync with each other. And I'm wondering if we can create something like that with a group of leaders where we find a way to synchronize really good leaders on a particular issue, project, whatever, and to be able to test out a result like that. I'm wondering your thoughts about that and your suggestions.
It is true that these effects scale up along with coherence. So the metaphor I use is there's something about lots of minds thinking about the same thing that creates the equivalent of a soap bubble. It's very thin, it's very fragile, it's also very real, but anything that comes along can pop it. Anything that is not in this coherent design can pop it. So something like that happens when you have multiple people doing these intention experiments as well. If you have 100 people who are completely on board and in alignment, and one comes along and says, this is stupid, that could break the whole thing. So if you're doing a demonstration for a group of people and they're really in alignment, you can see amazing things happen. It's difficult to do that, to create that level of alignment in everyone, because unless you already have calibrated how everyone feels about such things, you don't know what's going to happen. So as an experiment, what I would do, and I have done in conferences occasionally, I would get a random number generator and have some sort of display. And so I would ask the entire group to do something like you see a squiggly line, which is this deviation from chance over time. Let's all think about it going up. Just do it. Suspend your disbelief about whether or not you think it's even possible. Just think about it going up and then see what the results are. Okay, you get some kind of result. Now let's try to make it go down. So, and I mean, that's something that can be done. There's other ways of kind of hiding what the task is that makes it a little bit less scary for people, because some people don't like these things. So what you could have is there are at least one company I know that makes a random generator light. So it's like a little lamp that switches through 8 different colors depending on random events. And so you could have a random event as a radioactive decay, for example. You could have all kinds of different ways of controlling it. But you can then specify, okay, we're going to turn this thing on and we want it to go red. Of the 8 colors that it can go. We want red, or we want green, or whatever it is. Let's do it collectively. And so if you're lucky, it'll turn that color, and then the goal is keep it red, because every single time it's making a new random decision, and you see how long did it take to get the color that you wanted, and how long does it stay that way. And then if it works, switch it. Okay, now we're going green, or going some other color. So that would be a way of doing the same kind of experiment without having to worry about the details of what, electron tunneling and that sort of thing.
Right. And has that been done with positive results?
Well, a color lamp is at this point more or less a toy. It is used in groups, and groups do use it, and I've heard positive feedback that sometimes it works amazingly well. Whether it would work for a particular case, again, it's very hard to know because you don't know the people, you don't know anything.
Absolutely. Let's turn our conversation, Dean, to your latest book, which is right now about to come out. It's called The Science of Magic. First of all, the science of magic sounds like a contradiction in terms. Isn't the belief in magical thinking very antithetical to science?
Well, at first blush, it certainly sounds that way, except if you look at the history of science and you go back far enough, everything was magical. Like, we didn't have theories, we didn't do experimental work like we do today. And so the history of science has been taking phenomena and trying to figure out, is it what it appears to be? How do we explain it? And all of that. So the phenomena we're talking about are human experiences that have been expressed in every era of science and across culture. It's in every religion. It's just everywhere. We did a survey among scientists and engineers at elite universities where we did not ask what they believed, We asked, what have they experienced? So we gave them a list of 25 different kinds of experiences, all of which would be psychic, but we didn't use those terms. We just said, have you ever had an experience where you felt connected with somebody else's mind for some time? Things like that, or the feeling of being stared at. 94% said yes to at least one. And on average, of all of the few hundred people that we interviewed or did a survey on anonymously, 8 out of the 25. So people have these experiences. How they call it and what they believe is a completely different issue. The experience is there. So when you look then at experiences that come from the magical traditions, and you compare it with what we do in the laboratory, the thing that surprised me about this is that what we study in the laboratory and call it psychic is exactly the same as what traditional esoteric magic does. And so the connections are, in the magical traditions, they have the term enchantment, which is about projecting into your intention into the world. And in the laboratory, that's a psychokinetic effect. It's exactly the same thing. And in the magical traditions, there's divination, which is perceiving through space and time. What we call that clairvoyance, or ESP, or remote viewing. And then the third category of practice within the magical traditions is theurgy. And that's what we would call near-death experience and mediumship and other things like that. Something having to do with a purported spirit. So I became interested in this because I figured, well, the magical traditions have been around much, much longer than science. Science is roughly 500 years old. Magical traditions go back to the beginnings of shamanism, tens of thousands of years. What did they do that we don't know yet? Or could we learn something from those ancient traditions that we could either confirm through science or maybe learn something from it? So that's right. What my current book is about, and that's what my previous book was about as well.
And to me, the takeaway here is that it's important to be open to experience and not lay your judgment on it that, of course, influences what you're observing, and that what might distinguish what we call magic from science may simply be that with magic, we just don't know the mechanism of action, where science, we look for and have mechanisms of action.
Kind of, because it turns out that the esoteric practices did have an underlying philosophy of science. They didn't call it that, but they certainly had a philosophy and a way of thinking of why would this make sense. And it's what Huxley and others have called the perennial philosophy. When you look at the essence of all of these esoteric traditions, they would be what a philosopher would call idealism. They assumed that consciousness is the fundamental, more fundamental than the physical world. That's this perennial philosophy. And so it wasn't as though people forever just didn't care about explanations. They always did, because when you have an explanation, it guides you into how to use this phenomena, whatever it happens to be, just like we do in science. So the other interesting thing then about this magic psychic overlap is that the magical traditions assume that consciousness is fundamental in some way. We're finding at the leading edge of scientific disciplines that is coming back as a viable explanation, because science for the last few hundred years and today certainly still is very materialistic. It uses the philosophy of materialism. And so from that perspective, the brain works the way it does because it's like a classical computer. That's what it is. And so you die, you're dead. There's no meaning or purpose for anything. All of that is completely made up, except it has been so difficult from a materialistic perspective to explain why we have any subjective experience at all, that people within the neurosciences and physics and psychology and elsewhere are saying, you know what, maybe we should think of materialism as a special case. It's a special case that sort of enwraps the human condition, everyday experience. It does not describe everything. And so the moment you start thinking about, well, how would we expand it? You immediately bump up into other philosophies of science, which are more comprehensive than materialism. And that when you do that, you suddenly find that psychic phenomena are not anomalous anymore, and nor are magical practices. It's not anomalous. It would be expected the moment you begin to expand what you think reality is.
Right. And so consciousness explains the data more comprehensively than the material perspective explains it.
Right. Yeah. Most scientists are not taught that their worldview is actually a set of assumptions, right? We're not taught about philosophy of science, so it would never come up as a thing. Like, it's taken for granted everything's material. That's a limitation of our educational system. And I think it would behoove future educators to include at least one course in the philosophy of science and another course in the sociology of science for anybody who's pursuing a scientific career.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with that. Last question, Dean, and this has been a fascinating conversation. This is your 5th book, The Science of Magic, and can you tell us like 1 or 2 things that's new in this book for the audience?
Well, new as compared to my previous book called Real Magic, which came out in 2018. What's new in this is that in that 2018 book, Real Magic, I was saying it looks like the scientific world is coming around to the idea that we need a different philosophy. The reason I wrote this book, which is roughly 5 years later, is because it is now extremely clear that is happening. There's a sea change happening at the leading edge of academia now, where the psychic phenomena, mystical experiences, magical experiences would no longer be seen as anomalous. That's optimistic. So at minimum, without being even too optimistic, I can say that there is a change happening driven largely by the increase in the use of psychedelics and also in meditation. Both of those are forcing people's worldviews, especially in the academic or scientific world, to be revised. That there's way more interesting things going on than are accounted for by our existing philosophy. We need something bigger. And the direction of that's like the whole first third of the book that I open up with. The direction that we are moving is exactly in the direction that will take the idea of magic as an ancient thing, superstition and so on, that we can just look at in movies and say, no, actually, it all is pointing to the idea that something about consciousness is wrapped into the fabric of reality.
Nice. So, Dean, where can people get your book and learn more about the work you're doing?
Well, if you go to my personal website, which is deanradin.com, you'll find links to my book and a whole bunch of buttons to different bookstores. And I work at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, which is noetic.org, noetic.org.
Okay, great. Dean, thank you so much again for shedding some really interesting light on this subject. And we can think of that from a quantum perspective also. And thank you, audience, for joining us for this most interesting episode of our Quantum Leadership Podcast. And if you enjoyed this, please share it with others, share the link, subscribe, and give us a thumbs up in the responses. Thank you all very much. Until next week and next time. Bye-bye. For joining me on this Quantum Leadership Podcast. I hope today's conversation has inspired you to think bigger, lead more authentically, and take steps toward meaningful change. If you've enjoyed this episode, please share it with others and make sure you subscribe and go to my website, drstephensideroff.com. Thank you again.